So when we install a system like Gentoo, it's installing Gentoo is all about choice. That's a big part of why this distribution exists in the first place. Now you could install some other Linux distribution, for example, Ubuntu. Ubuntu will make a lot of choices for you during the installation. And after you install that, you will have Unity desktop environment and lots of other things that are just ready for you to use. And if you don't want to use those, you can go in and just change it. You can use any Linux system and just change it, but if you know that you're going to change it, why would you install it in the first place? If you know that you want to make all those choices, you might as well make the choices yourself from the beginning. So we're going to start by talking about preparing the hard drive. And this is pretty much before you even install anything. You will think about a lot of choices you have to make, or, well, at least some choices you have to make before you even put Linux on the hard drive. So first of all, we have to choose if we're going to multi-boot or not. And I have to turn on the laser pointer here so I can move my mouse around and you can see what I'm pointing at. My nose is itching. So pretty much any computer you buy is going to have some operating system pre-installed. And that operating system is usually not Linux because most people will want something very simple and uncomplicated, which is Windows and OS X. You can say a lot of things about Windows and OS X, but they are very uncomplicated most of the time. Until you start wanting to do something like you want to make all the choices yourself, then they become very complicated. But anyway, since this is already on the hard drive and since it's like the thing that most people are going to use, are you going to keep it or are you just going to say that you don't want it? Some people use one computer with Windows and a different computer with Linux. Some people just don't want to touch Windows. And some people use Windows and Linux on the same computer, which is multi-booting. But you could also use several different distributions on the same computer, like several different versions of Linux. And then you would also be multi-booting. And if you're going to multi-boot, it has quite a big effect on how you choose your partition setup. So I'm going to use Windows for collaboration with people at work and so on. So I'm going to dual boot Windows and Gentoo. The second choice we need to make is, do we want MBR or GPT? Now, if we're going to keep Windows, Windows already made this choice for us. In my case, GPT is already selected. But actually, I want to select GPT anyway because, well, MBR is only 4 partitions. And while there are some solutions for that, we can use lots of partitions even in an MBR system. I just feel like, why not go for it, GPT, since I know that I'm going to have a lot of partitions and since this option is out there. should I say, I could say something more about this, but I don't think I'm going to say that much more. I did say something in the previous video about MBR and GPT, so you should know what you're picking in this choice. But we could say that MBR is very trusted. All of the bugs have been ironed out a long time ago, but it's old and it's sort of stuck in this old design based on a different time when we had very limited size of the hardware. I mean, the MBR is 512 bytes or something. There's very little information that goes into there. And then they start writing some information on other parts of the hard drive to compensate for the small space they have, which is kind of, well, it's a bit weird way to do it. What people are saying is that it wouldn't actually be so difficult to fix MBR and just change some design choices to allow for many more partitions than 4 partitions, for example. And sure, you could do that, but they didn't do that. Instead, they created GPT. So since no one is fixing MBR, we might as well just move on to GPT. It's the way that I think about it. On the other hand, when they introduced this UEFI system, Microsoft, of course, went in to say that they modify the EFI so that on some computers, you're only able to start Microsoft or Red Hat Enterprise Edition. Is it Enterprise or whatever? Red Hat. So they're locking you up to using those corporate systems. And for people who want to make a choice, they're not really happy when they lock you up. So there's been a lot of criticism against this simply based because there was some corporate interest at some point who kind of destroyed it. But the thing is that that's not really the case now for GPT and UEFI. I mean, this is not locked anymore in the same sense. And since they have solved a lot of the flaws from MBR, I think that this should be a good way to go. There is, of course, the slight risk of this being a bit newer system than MBR and a bit less trusted, and someone who doesn't know how to use it writes some software that's going to break it and you lose all your data. But I have backups, so I don't care about that. It's fine. I'm going to use GPT. And when I use GPT, that means I'm going to use UEFI when I boot. I'm not going to use the BIOS like the old way of doing it. So when I use UEFI to boot, then I need a boot partition, which is essentially the same thing as the MBR, but a lot bigger because we can load a lot of more interface drivers and stuff. So when Windows is installed, they automatically create a few different partitions. And one of those partitions is the EFI boot. And one of them is the actual Windows partition. And as you can see here, these are 4 partitions. So if you use the MBR, we don't really have any more partitions to use, which, as I said, you can get around that, but still, we already see that in this situation, we want to use GPT. In the Gentoo wiki, they have a manual for installing Gentoo, which is very well written. They put 4 partitions for Gentoo as well. And one of them is EFI boot. So what about this EFI boot? Should I use the same as Windows and just, if I'm gonna dual boot, like I said, should I put these two together, or should I create one here and one there, a new one for Linux? Well, I can use it either way of those. It doesn't really matter. It seems like a lot of people just merge them and use the same one. The thing is that when I tried that, I didn't quite know what I was doing. I was just playing around and seeing what I could do, and I accidentally broke it. So that was very annoying, and I had to just reinstall Windows to fix it, basically. So since this can break, there is something in EFI to handle that, which is you can set some priority so that you start boot, if you have several EFI boot partitions, you start booting from one, and if that's broken, it automatically moves on to the next one. And there's a great reason for just making a new EFI boot partition when you install a new operating system on your machine. So I'm gonna make a new EFI boot partition just because if I break that, it's just automatically gonna fall back to the Windows EFI boot and start Windows automatically without caring about me. Which I think is great because I can still use the computer without working a lot to get it working again. So now that we know that, I should choose if I should use a bootloader or if I should just use UEFI to start the computer. So UEFI can function as a bootloader. When I start up the computer, I can hit the button, and when I hit that button, I can choose which operating system to load from my hard drive or from a USB stick or something else. But then I have to sit there and press that key and make sure that I press it within 1 or 2 seconds of time. And it's not so smooth to use that. Also, when I use that, I can just choose the partition to start from. And in Linux, when you compile the kernel, if something goes wrong, you're going to save the previous kernel so that you can just boot the previous kernel if something goes wrong when you compile the new one. And if I use UEFI as a bootloader, I can't pick that kernel. So in practice, it's easier to just put a bootloader on the computer and then use the bootloader to select the kernel. And that way, if something goes wrong when I compile it, I can just go back to the previous one. Of course, I could also boot off a USB stick. I could change root into the hard drive and recompile the kernel or something. But it's just easier to use a bootloader. If you use UEFI, the boot process will be a tiny bit faster. But whatever. And I'm just going to go with the most popular choice here, which is GRUB 2. There are others as well, such as Lilo or something like that. Lilo, I guess, is the oldest one, the Linux loader. But I don't really care about the bootloader. It's just a very small part of the startup process. So I'm just going to use the most popular one because it's probably going to be around for a long time and I don't have to learn something new. If it's the best one, I don't care because it's such a small part of the system. So then we come to the next choice. When we install GRUB as a bootloader, the official guide or the Gentoo wiki guide suggests that you put GRUB on a special 2 megabyte partition. It's a tiny, tiny partition just for GRUB. And then the boot partition as well. Now, as I understand, the reason for this is simply that with some systems, when you dual boot, there were some bugs with GRUB so that it didn't behave as expected. And that was especially when dual booting Windows 7 and Linux on the same machine with EFI. Then when you put GRUB on the EFI boot, it's going to crash somehow. Or there were some bugs associated with that. So then, if you make this special partition just for GRUB, you're not going to have those bugs. But on the other hand, that was 1.5 years ago, and they should have sold it by now, I think. But most of all, this wiki entry is for a clean install of Gentoo, not dual booting, just Gentoo. And they still recommend GRUB on a separate partition, which is really weird to me because it's supposed to be a fix for that Windows 7 incompatibility. I got Windows 10, which, as far as I know, don't have that problem. And yeah, I haven't tried this yet, actually. I first tried once with just using EFI, and I'm gonna redo it and put the GRUB because I realized the whole thing about selecting a kernel is gonna be a good thing for me. So I'm gonna redo it and put GRUB in there. But I just think that I'm just gonna put GRUB on the boot, EFI boot partition. I'm not gonna have this separate partition, and I don't know why they put it, because as far as I can understand, you don't need to do that for anything else than some old Windows 7 installation, which should be fixed by now because the problem appeared 1.5 years ago or more. It's a bit weird. Anyway, I'm gonna put GRUB on the Linux EFI boot partition, and I'm gonna have separate EFI boot partitions for Linux and Windows. So if this one fails for whatever reason, the Windows installation will still be intact and can run. So the next choice is, do we want to swap? A swap partition is for easing up some of the memory management in the random access memory. And for hibernation, all of the RAM needs to be written down to the swap. So we need to have more than 2 times the RAM size as a swap space, because we need to have the RAM active, and also we need to write it down somehow. So hibernation needs a bit more. I try to find, I mean, let's say that I have 2 gigabytes of RAM, then I should have 4 gigabytes of RAM for hibernation. No, I should have 4 gigabytes of swap for hibernation. But I can't see any reason why I wouldn't put 50 gigabyte. Why shouldn't I put 100 gigabyte as swap? Why not? And I can't find any information on why I should keep it small. It should be at least 512 megabyte. I should never really put it smaller than that, because then there's no point of using it at all. But it seems like people think that there's no point in making it bigger either. But I don't know. It seems like if you're working on a very big video file or something like that, maybe is good. I don't know. But I guess I will go for 12 gigabyte on a 4 gigabyte RAM laptop. So it's 3 times RAM. So I should be safe, but I'm not overdoing it. I don't know. I think there should be a bit more documentation on this available, because I think the documentation there is now is not very clear on the optimum. Basically, they're just saying that just try a lot of different things and you will find out what is optimal for you in your use case. But in your use case, only servers have use cases where they use the computer the same way all the time. As a desktop user, I'm going to use the computer differently all the time. So anyway, moving on. We have partitions in our hard drive. We could do it in a different way. We could do a logical volume management and map all the volumes logically instead of defining them in a traditional way. So the benefit of that is that you can have logical volumes that span over many different disk drives. And some people love this and they want to do it on every single installation that they do. And personally, I don't really understand why. I can only see a few cases where this would be great. Because normally you only have one hard drive in a computer. And if you have 2 hard drives in a computer, you can mount one as home and one as root, or use Windows on one hard drive and use Linux on the other hard drive. You just use the hard drives as partitions. I don't understand why you want to span multiple hard drives. It would be very few cases where I can see that this is useful, personally. So I'm just going to go with the old traditional way because I don't see why this is useful for myself. Now, after we say that we have all these partitions, we need to also choose what file system to use. So FAT and NTFS is just for Windows, so we don't need to care about those, except that UEFI standard also uses VFAT. So it's not only Windows, it's also UEFI standard. But anyway, we don't need to panic about that. We're not going to use it outside of where we have to use it, basically. ext2 is the old tried and tested file system for Linux. It used to be on everything, so it should be entirely bug-free by now. The bad thing about this is that it doesn't have journaling. So file system checks takes a lot longer time because it doesn't journal what it was doing with the files. On the other hand, the good thing about this is that it doesn't have journaling, because that's great for reducing wear. And especially on an SSD drive, you don't want to write to the drive all the time. Reading is fine most of the time for hard drives. It's not a big problem. But if you write all the time to the hard drive, you're gonna have some wear on it and it's gonna break. On a normal hard drive, you get a bad sector, you can just tell the hard drive to skip that bad sector and don't use it anymore because it's bad. But on an SSD, if you get one bad sector, the entire hard drive just crashes. So then you don't want to write too much to the hard drive so that you don't wear it out. And then ext2 is great. But ext4 is even better, newer, faster, stronger. It has journaling, but you can also turn off journaling. and you can have huge size files without a problem. Then there are other alternatives as well. For example, JFS, which is the IBM developed one, RiserFS, which is the non-developed one, I think. But there are some special cases if you have a database or something, lots of tiny files. This is going to be a lot faster. I don't know. I think this is pretty much everyone wants ext4, I think, except for a few ones that want to use ext2. And after all of this, my conclusion for my own hard drive is that I'm going to use Windows and Gentoo dual booting. I'm going to use GPT, and I'm going to use 2 different UEFI boot partitions. And on one of those UEFI boot partitions, the one with Linux, I'm going to put GRUB 2, which is GRUB. Windows creates its partitions, and those are going to be just, I'm not going to touch them, except that the main drive has been resized to make space for Linux at the end. The EFI boot partition is going to be very small, about 200 megabytes. I'm not decided about the sizes here yet, but my idea is I'm going to have the swap for 12 gig and the root ext4, and I want the home on a different partition, simply because I'm going to keep all my files if I decide to just start over with a new installation of Gentoo or something. So I'm also putting the TMP, the temporary files, on a different partition. And this is simply because I want to keep the system reusable for the future, and I kind of think that I might put TMP as a RAM, a file system in the RAM, so that I never use the hard drive for temporary files. I just want temporary files in the RAM. I don't want it on the hard drive because it's slow. Maybe not now, but in the future. So I'm going to prepare myself for using that by just putting the temporary files on its own partition. And I don't need journaling for that, so I just got to put it ext2. The Unix system resources are the program files, and I don't need to have journaling for these either, because basically I can mount this as read-only. I don't need to write this at all. So just to simplify the management of those files, I'm just going to keep it separate and use a non-journaling file system. Maybe that could potentially make it faster too, but I could mount it as read-only sometime in the future if I want to, once I have my system up and running in the way that I want it to be. So that's why I want to keep this separate. And then finally, the variables will also be kept on a separate ext2 file system. And that is also a bit because I can just reinstall the base system without worrying about formatting a lot of stuff. I will keep some variables for the future, and I might also in the future want to do something special about this at some point. So that's why I'm keeping it separate from the beginning. Anyway, that's it. This is what the base installation is going to look like, and this is what I'm going to prepare before I even start installing the Linux system itself.